Before legal conflicts, public debates, and institutional scrutiny shaped the Adventist experience in the United States, the daily lives of these religious groups were marked by simple routines, regular work, and a constant relationship with time. 19th-century Adventist communities formed in rural and semi-urban environments where survival depended on the rhythm of the seasons, the predictability of manual labor, and practical decisions related to the land, family, and neighborhood. They were people embedded in the same social fabric as their contemporaries, sharing customs, economic concerns, and expectations common to a rapidly transforming society. Most lived in modest houses, often built by the family themselves, surrounded by small farms or integrated into growing villages. The day began early, guided by natural light and tasks in the fields, workshops, or local commerce. Men and women actively participated in maintaining the home, cultivating food, caring for animals, and raising children. Work was seen as a practical necessity and as part of personal identity, not as a religious statement. Time was divided between physical effort, community life, and moments of reading, usually at night when the lighting allowed. These groups organized themselves discreetly. Meetings took place in private homes, adapted barns, or small rented halls. There was not yet a complex institutional structure, nor a significant public presence. Communication occurred through letters, regional newspapers, and occasional meetings, often planned in advance to coincide with agricultural fairs or family visits. The circulation of ideas was slow, dependent on simple printed materials and oral transmission, which reinforced personal ties and a sense of closeness among the participants. The observance of the Sabbath, which would later become a point of tension with civil authorities and employers, was initially practiced in an almost domestic way. For many, it meant reorganizing the work week, completing tasks before sunset on Friday, and reserving Saturday for rest, reading, and family time. In regions where agricultural work allowed for some flexibility, this practice did not generate major conflicts. In industrial areas, however, it required informal negotiations with bosses and colleagues, still possible in a context where labor relations were more personalized. Food reflected both economic conditions and prevailing ideas about health at the time. Home gardens provided vegetables, grains, and fruits, supplemented by locally purchased produce. Food preparation was a central activity in women's daily lives, carried out using traditional techniques and readily available ingredients. Some families adopted specific dietary habits, but this was neither uniform nor imposed, arising more as a result of reading, conversations, and practical experiences than formal guidance. Children's education largely took place at home or in local schools. Reading, writing, and arithmetic were valued skills, necessary for practical life and access to newspapers and books. Fathers and mothers dedicated time to basic education, often at night, after their daily work. The idea of independent schools was still developing, and the priority was to ensure that children could integrate into the wider society without losing their family ties. Relations with non-Adventist neighbors were generally cordial. Exchanges of services, help during harvest periods, and participation in community events were part of normal life. Religious differences were known, but rarely escalated into direct conflicts. Mutual respect was sustained by economic interdependence and social codes that valued peaceful coexistence. Adventist identity was not yet perceived as a threat or a challenge to the established order. Personal records and correspondence from the period show a constant concern for the stability, health, and future of their children. Ellen G. White, acting as an observer and writer, described in her accounts scenes of daily life, long journeys on dirt roads, simple houses, and encounters marked more by hospitality than formality. Her texts record a group in formation, dealing with material limitations and the expectations of a changing society, without fully anticipating the pressures that would come. This way of life, centered on the normalcy of work, family, and community, created a social base that allowed Adventists to face subsequent transformations with a certain internal cohesion, setting the stage for challenges that would arise as public visibility increased. As the 19th century progressed, the everyday normalcy of Adventists began to be affected by external changes that did not arise abruptly, but slowly insinuated themselves into the surrounding social environment. The expansion of cities, the growth of factories, and the standardization of working hours altered relationships previously based on personal agreements. Where before an employer knew the families of their employees and adjusted schedules according to the seasonal need, now there were fixed shifts, factory bells, and more rigid rules. For many Adventists, this transition was felt first as a practical discomfort, not as a religious conflict. Industrial work brought more stable financial gains, but it also reduced autonomy over one's own time. Workers were expected on the production line 6 days a week, and absence on one of those days could result in a wage deduction or dismissal. In their diaries and letters, some Adventists recorded attempts at silent negotiation, cautious requests, and the hope that their good reputation as workers would compensate for the difference in schedules. In many cases, these negotiations still worked, sustained by local relationships and the scarcity of skilled labor. In urban commerce and services, the situation was similar. Stores maintained increasingly predictable hours, and competition demanded a constant presence. Adventist owners had to decide between closing their doors on certain days and losing customers or discreetly adapting their practices. These decisions were made within the family, evaluating income, reputation, and economic survival. There was not yet an organized public discourse on rights or freedoms, only individual choices made in silence. Community life was also beginning to change. Meetings in homes became more frequent in some regions, not because of persecution, but for practicality. The growth of cities made long journeys difficult, and the urban pace shortened the time available for extended gatherings. Even so, these meetings maintained a domestic character, with simple meals, long conversations, and shared reading. Informality remained a hallmark, reinforcing the sense of belonging amidst an increasingly impersonal external environment. The press played an increasingly important role during this period. Religious and secular newspapers circulated more rapidly, carrying news of moral debates, local laws, and judicial decisions from other regions. Adventists read these texts attentively, not as activists, but as citizens trying to understand the world around them. The habit of nightly reading, already common, gained new importance as a source of information and practical guidance. Comments were exchanged in letters, creating a network of shared, albeit fragmented, perception. Health and education issues remained central to daily life. Infectious diseases, workplace accidents, and poor sanitation affected entire families. The search for preventative methods and more careful habits was motivated by immediate need, not ideology. In this context, accounts and advice recorded by Ellen G. White were read as observations from someone familiar with the hardships of the time, describing exhausting journeys, simple lodgings, and the physical frailty common to many. Her writings reflected a time when health and subsistence were intimately linked. Children's education began to be rethought as public schools adopted more rigid calendars and standardized content. Adventist parents observed these changes with interest and caution, seeking a balance between social integration and the continuity of family life. In some homes, improvised initiatives for supplementary education emerged, carried out after school hours. These practices were not seen as open resistance, but as a natural extension of parental responsibility. Relationships with neighbors remained largely stable. Mutual help with harvests, construction, and care during periods of illness continued. However, small differences began to be noticed more frequently, especially when work and rest schedules diverged. Occasional comments, curious glances, or direct questions arose, still without declared hostility. Adventist identity was beginning to become more visible, not through deliberate action, but by contrast with the changing social environment. This interim period was marked by silent adaptation. Families adjusted routines, evaluated job opportunities, and closely observed the legal and cultural changes around them. There was not yet a widespread sense of confrontation, but rather a gradual perception that the previous normality was being redefined by greater forces. These accumulated experiences prepared the ground for a moment when individual choices would cease to be merely personal and would have broader public consequences. As social changes solidified at the end of the 19th century, the daily lives of Adventists began to be governed by more explicit rules and less flexible public expectations. Municipal laws regarding business operations, labor regulations, and codes of conduct began to reach dimensions previously resolved at the local level. For families accustomed to adjusting their schedules informally, this standardization represented a new layer of practical concern. The challenge was not only to comply with rules, but to understand how these rules applied to concrete everyday situations. In larger cities, Sunday rest became increasingly associated with social order and public morality. The closing of establishments on certain days began to be monitored, and individual behavior began to be observed more closely. Adventists who ran small businesses felt the pressure to conform to prevailing expectations to avoid fines or loss of license. Many tried intermediate solutions, altering hours, transferring responsibilities to family members, or reducing the visibility of their choices. These strategies reveal an attempt to preserve economic stability without provoking unnecessary conflict. In the salaried work environment, the situation became more delicate. Factories and workshops adopted rigid schedules, and absences on specific days were formally recorded. Some workers accepted less desirable roles in exchange for greater flexibility, while others frequently changed jobs, seeking more lenient conditions. These decisions affected family income and long-term security, creating a constant climate of uncertainty. Letters and personal records indicate nights of careful calculation, evaluating expenses, salaries, and future possibilities. Domestic life, however, maintained elements of continuity. Homes continued to be centers of production and social interaction. Kitchens were spaces of intense work, where food was prepared to last for several days. Backyards and vegetable gardens remained important for supplementing the diet. Healthcare continued to be a daily concern, aggravated by long working hours and often unsanitary urban conditions. The family functioned as a support unit, absorbing external impacts and redistributing responsibilities as needed. Community meetings began to take on a more organized character, not in search of visibility but out of a need for coordination. The exchange of information about job opportunities, legal changes, and personal experiences became essential. These meetings were still simple, held in modest spaces with improvised chairs and limited lighting. The conversation revolved around concrete facts, reports from other localities, and practical observations. There were no broad plans or defined collective strategies, only the sharing of experiences in an environment of trust. The circulation of printed materials increased, and with it the perception that similar situations were occurring in different regions. Reports of fines, warnings, and dismissals arrived through newspapers and mail. For many, reading these texts produced an ambiguous feeling. On the one hand, it confirmed that they were not alone. On the other, it made it clear that the pressures were neither isolated nor temporary. Even so, the predominant response remained cautious, avoiding unnecessary exposure and maintaining focus on daily survival. Children grew up in this context of transition. They observed adults dealing with difficult choices and learned indirectly about adaptation and prudence. School and child labor, common at the time, exposed them to broader social norms, while the home remained a space of continuity. Parents strove to transmit habits of discipline and responsibility, preparing their children for a less flexible world than the one in which they had grown up. Relationships with society in general became more complex. Cordial coexistence persisted, but was punctuated by episodes of estrangement and critical comments. Minor conflicts previously resolved informally began to involve local authorities or official records. These events were not constant, but sufficient to alter the perception of security. Life continued its normal course with work, meals, and meetings, but under the growing awareness that private choices could be interpreted publicly. This period was not marked by sudden ruptures, but by a gradual accumulation of experiences that redefined boundaries and expectations. The Adventist normality built over previous decades needed to be constantly adjusted to an environment regulated by stricter laws and social standards. These silent adaptations shaped attitudes and prepared individuals and communities for a scenario in which peaceful coexistence would require not only work and prudence, but also clearer positions before the surrounding society. At the beginning of the 20th century, the daily experience of Adventists could no longer be understood solely from the perspective of domestic choices or local agreements. Pressures that had previously manifested sporadically became part of the institutional environment. State laws, judicial decisions, and municipal policies began to define clear limits for the operation of commerce, the organization of work, and the use of public space. For families accustomed to resolving issues directly and personally, this new scenario demanded constant attention and a broader understanding of how society functioned. Adaptation continued to occur at a practical level. Many reorganized their sources of income, seeking independent activities, expanded subsistence farming, or trades that allowed greater control over their own time. Others accepted lower-paying jobs, but with conditions considered more predictable. These choices were not idealized nor seen as heroic. They were concrete responses to a context in which stability and survival became daily priorities. The household economy was carefully managed, and any change in the budget had a direct impact on food, housing, and the education of children. Urban life imposed new rhythms. The sounds of factories, trams, and public clocks marked the hours, reducing the margin for informal adjustments. Life followed schedules defined by external institutions, and predictability came with surveillance. Small merchants learned to deal with inspections, licenses, and registrations. Salaried workers dealt with supervisors and written regulations. The relationship between the individual and authority became more impersonal, mediated by documents and procedures. Inside the home, however, an attempt to preserve continuity persisted. Meals were still moments of gathering, prepared with simple ingredients and consumed at times adjusted to the family's possibilities. Reading remained a common evening activity, now including newspapers that reported on public debates and legal decisions. Conversations at the table reflected practical concerns, accounts of work, and comments on local events. The home functioned as a space for recovery after a day lived under stricter external rules. Community networks gained strategic importance. Information about laws, job opportunities, and successful experiences circulated more rapidly. Mutual trust, built over years of coexistence, allowed for the frank exchange of advice. These contacts were not formal, but they helped reduce uncertainty. Knowing how another family had dealt with a similar situation could guide future decisions, avoiding costly mistakes. The Adventist presence in society was becoming more visible, not through a deliberate pursuit of exposure, but out of the need to respond to official inquiries and notifications. In some cases, this resulted in public records, local hearings, or mentions in the press. For individuals accustomed to discretion, this visibility was uncomfortable. Still, many continued to act in a reserved manner, focusing on fulfilling basic obligations and maintaining family routines. Accounts from this period reveal a constant effort to find balance. There was an awareness that certain choices could have legal or economic consequences, but also a conviction that life needed to proceed in an organized and predictable way. Fear did not dominate daily life, but it was present as a factor in calculation. Decisions were made based on past experiences, observation of the environment, and careful risk assessment. Younger generations grew up in a different context than their parents. For them, formal rules and strong institutions were already part of the norm. School, work, and public spaces presented clear expectations of behavior. At the same time, the home transmitted habits of caution, planning, and adaptation. This combination shaped a worldview more attentive to social structures and the consequences of individual decisions. Looking back, it is possible to see that Adventist life before the most intense pressures was characterized by a normalcy built around work, family, and community life. This foundation didn't disappear with the increasing restrictions, but it was adjusted, reinterpreted, and in some cases strained. Daily life remained the central space for negotiation between personal values and external demands, defining how ordinary individuals navigated a period of profound change in American society. These accumulated experiences, lived in a silent and practical way, explain how seemingly discrete communities managed to maintain internal cohesion amidst increasingly broad legal and cultural transformations, paving the way for episodes that would more explicitly mark their relationship with the state and with public opinion. In closing this historical portrait, it becomes clear that before explicit religious pressures, Adventist life in the United States was built within the social normality of its time, sustained by constant work, local relationships, and practical decisions. It was this everyday, quiet, and common experience that shaped how these communities would later face a progressively regulated and less flexible public environment.